So welcome back, everybody. We'll now give the floor to Dr. Matthias Zeba. Matthias Zeba is a researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights of Iraq Research in Bolzano, Bozen, and is going to present a talk about linguistic minorities and autonomies. Somehow there was an assist from the previous speaker towards the present one. So, Dr. Zeba, thank you for taking part in this symposium, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, the organizers and my fellow contributors for today's opportunity. I think it is a great opportunity to shed light on an overlooked spot, maybe. Also, a spot that I was talking before with Kyriaki. It seems tiny, but when you look inside of it, it becomes huge for all the relations that are between these concepts and also the concepts themselves, how to create boundaries between these different concepts. And what I will try to present to you today, as I said, I entitled my presentation "Spoken by People Owned by Territories." And what I want to discuss with you today, more than analyze, because I don't have a framework of analysis. It's more, I have more questions than answers today, for sure. It's to see why this is the case, and what are the dynamics between autonomies, minorities, and languages. Many points were already raised by Kyriaki, but just a disclaimer, I am a linguist myself, and what I want to do today is really trying to dig deeper into the linguistic element, specifically a purely linguistic element, if there is a relation between the claimed, chosen, implemented form of autonomy and more linguistic factors on the language spoken. And clearly, I want to start from the reasons why we protect diversity, because I think it is important to understand then the outcomes, and go through maybe some categories that can be used to see this relation, and then some examples or factors that I try to underline this relation. So it is clear that in a system and in a context where there is linguistic diversity, we have to choose a language. And this choice is clearly asymmetrical most of the time, because the language of choice is the majority language, is the stronger language for political, historic, economic, military reasons. And so the role of minority language policies is to restore and to try to accommodate linguistic justice. So to grant language equal respect, try to re-establish naturalistic, let's say, form of language equality, or at least to accommodate the negative effect of this choice between languages. We can approach linguistic justice with different ideologies. On the one hand, we have, we can call them instrumentalist ideologies. So we protect languages because they are tools for communication. But these may lead and has led to approaches that are clearly monoglossic. So if language just a communication tool, why don't everybody speak just one language and we choose a lingua franca and that's it? So to protect linguistic diversity, we need to reconcile both the instrumental reason, but also the identity-related reasons. And for this reason, we have different ideologies. We can have linguistic territorialism, where Alavan Paris, where we argue for monolingual regions, where we have queen languages and a king language as a lingua franca, not very gender equality in this concept, but or linguistic pluralism, where we have a multilingual ideology and we protect more languages inside these different ideologies bring different solutions that can start with provision, protecting members of linguistic minority groups without disputing the dominance of the majority. So without a clear form of autonomy for these linguistic minorities, we can have forms of linguistic autonomy in a territorial sense, as in South Tyrol. We can have institutional bilingualism, where we have more languages recognized as official in a state, or we can have linguistic federalism, where we have different languages in different subunits of the state, and then some state languages. Obviously, as you can see, I mean, it's old stuff probably, but here each of these solutions contains both elements of personality and territoriality in any case. In the end, if we use the category of non-territorial autonomy and territorial autonomy to maybe to understand and to divide the claims then of the minority, we need to understand that there are some issues related to this one. One, for sure, it's that territory in the end always matters. Non-territorial autonomy, cultural autonomy, as you want to call it, in the end, it's, I mean, at least confined in a state, but in most cases, it's even confined in a subunit of the state, or in more subunits of the state when it has a transnational dimension. So have some example maybe later. Also, given some groups may relate as a territorial autonomy because they are part of a territorial autonomy, but can also be a non-territorial, can relate as a non-territorial autonomy for other reasons. The most prominent example is for sure the French speakers in Canada. They are a territorial minority in Quebec, but they relate as a non-territorial autonomy with the federal state. And also, and this is going a bit more into more linguistic considerations. In my opinion, the effective implementation of some language rights require a territorial dimension. And I'm referring specifically to, but we can discuss this later, to educational language rights. There have been attempts, most recent, also relating to, as mentioned before by Daria Valenzi, to the ways to protect and promote the languages of new minorities. There have been solutions trying to see how remote language learning can help the provision of educational language rights. But we saw it with COVID, and it is important to have a context of this. So the territorial element for these rights is still quite important. On the other hand, clearly, territorial boundaries are not linguistic boundaries. First of all, as mentioned before by my fellow contributors, languages travel with the speakers. So increasing mobility means also increasing multilingualism, and maybe increasing claims by different minority groups, how they will perceive them. But linguistic pluralism itself does not mean to fully recognize diversity. And this is because territorial boundaries are increasingly externally, but they are very blurry also internally. When we recognize a language, we choose a language, we don't solely choose between a language and another language, but we choose also a language and variants of that. That can be very important. So it also linguistic pluralism entails in some sense a choice, even if we choose a language between its own language group. Don't know how to explain it. So to arrive to the question of my presentation today, is there a relation between the linguistic elements and the claimed form of autonomy? Or how does the linguistic element influence claims for specific autonomies for other autonomies? And it was quite challenging to me to answer this question, because I wanted to stick to linguistic features of languages. Because, as said by Kirake, for language obviously has also a political function, enters into resonance with historical elements, with religious elements as well. But my question is really if there are features, linguistic features of a language that can predict the claims of the minority group. And I try to go through some factors. So the first one is maybe we can try to discuss if the size of language community influences the outcome and strength, and also the typology of the autonomy claim. The first problem is how to define a language, both internally and externally. If I speak, Silvio Ferrari before touch upon this issue. If I speak a language, if I am now speaking English, am I part of the linguistic community of English speakers? Quite debatable. In the linguistic field, at least, it's very debatable. Also, if I speak a variant, am I part of the overarching overarching standard language community? It depends. Some variants may, during history, voice different claims in the end. And for instance, I mean, there is the issue about the Silesian minority in Poland, which is perceived by Polish authority as a dialect of Poland. And I'm not even going into the issue of Veneto or other regional languages or dialects in it. So this is an issue. Another issue is that size itself seems not to predict the strength of economic claims. Also because size is both can be perceived both in percentual terms and also in absolute terms, and it relates a lot also with language vitality. For instance, Basque, which is now protected and promoted and revitalized a lot in the Basque region, in 1981, had only the 21% of Basque residents spoke Basque. And above all, the autonomy claims came from the cities, whereas the most of Basque speakers came from the countryside. So in this sense, it is difficult to see a correlation. Another case, Sardinian is spoken in the last I think the last survey was in 2011, and is spoken by 68% of the population. But this did not result in a clear linguistic policy by the region, and also in not a strong linguistic claims in terms of autonomy by the certain speakers. Other example could be, for instance, Silesian again in Poland, which have entered into the autonomous discourse only recently, and when they entered into the autonomous discourse, then the speakers or perceived speakers raised. And on the other hand, we have German speakers in South Tyrol, which are less than the Silesian speaker in Poland, but had always a very strong autonomy. So, is it a factor size? We can call in then the geolinguistic feature of a language. I divide languages in three categories: linguistic islands, linguistic peninsulas, and linguistic archipelagos. So linguistic islands are all those languages or those contexts where we have a language that has quite a high degree of linguistic distance from the surrounding languages. Linguistic peninsulas, when we have a peninsula of a language inside another nation, which is a national language in a neighboring states. And in the case of linguistic archipelagos, we have different languages inside the same region with very mixed settlements. Well, with regard to linguistic islands, we have different indeed outcomes in Europe. If we take two very different languages from the surrounding languages, like Sami and Basque again, we have strong territorial autonomy in one case, and we have a weaker non-territorial autonomy in the other case. We can maybe say that linguistic archipelagos are better accommodated through non-territorial forms of autonomy. That was also the reason why Bauer and Renner put forward the idea of cultural autonomy. But we may say, and I think this is quite more sound, we can discuss about it, that in the case of linguistic peninsulas, So when we have a kin state behind the minority, territorial forms of autonomy, territorial claims are much stronger, also because they are supported by another institution. And then I try to go even deeper into more linguistic field. And the first one that I would like to do is standardization. I talked before about variants and standard form of languages, and I don't see standardization as a precondition for minority for autonomy claims, because there are many autonomies throughout Europe that don't have a standardized form of their language. But I would also say that in the long term, at least, it is a necessity. I don't know if it is the standardization process that influences in a positive way the autonomy process, but I would say that the autonomy process may influence for sure in a very positive way the standardization process, because it is necessary in the end. If we want the effective implementation of educational language rights, we need a standard language. We need a standard script for the public use of the language and for the every administrative stuff that can happen inside the territorial autonomy. And this sometimes happens before the autonomy, the claiming of the autonomy, sometimes after. But I think it's very important. Other two very related concepts, I can analyze them together, are the concepts of diglossia on the one hand and dilalia. Dilalia is a very specific concept, but I think it is useful to understand other dynamics. So diglossia is when we have two languages, a language which is learned in the childhood, and a B language which is a lingua franca. And the A language is situated in the informal sphere, and it's used in the formal sphere, whereas the B language, which is most of the time the majority language, is used in formal communication. Well, when here we have diglossia, we may say that the communicative interest is less strong. Well, I've spoken before between the relation between identity-related and instrumental interests. When we are eroding the instrumental interest, when we have a minority that is already integrated in a linguistic sense, at least in a more larger linguistic ecosystem, maybe, but this is something to discuss, the autonomy claims may be less strong. But we have cases of dilalia, and dilalia is even a diluted form of diglossia. When we have A and B are learned both in the childhood, or even we have A which is learned later, they are both used at informal level, whereas at formal level you just have B. And this is the case of Italy, of regional languages of Italy, where most of us maybe has learned the local dialect together with Italian, but they use both Italian in formal communication. But we have cases, discuss the Veneto case, where the linguistic element is very strong and is very embedded into the autonomy and secessionist claims of the region. Is it used for a purpose? Yes, no, I don't know, but it is there. And I think in this case, there is no clear correlation between diglossia, dilalia, and the autonomy claim. And finally, I mentioned it before, linguistic distance. So does linguistic distance influence the strength of autonomy claims? Is a minority that speaks a language that is very distant from the language of the majority framing stronger claims than languages that minorities that speak languages that are more similar? A case. Are the autonomy claims from the community? Basque is very, very distant in linguistic terms from Spanish. Catalan is very near. But here again, we have similar outcomes in the end, with a very different linguistic scenario. And so in that case, again, it is to be discussed. I mean, these are all considerations that need further research for sure. But it seems hard to draw a correlation between these elements. And so in the end, to conclude, does the linguistic element influence the claimed form of autonomy? In my opinion, it really depends. There are some linguistic features, for sure, being in a territorial peninsula, the standardization that can influence autonomy. But as said before, we can also discuss how autonomy influence the linguistic element and how autonomy itself may be achieved through other factors and through other narratives can contribute to the survival or to the, say, to stopping language shift in some way. And this is something that I think it is also important to discuss. And I'm very glad that today we are here in an interdisciplinary scenario, because sometimes these courses are very monodisciplinary. Concepts tend to be understood also in different ways in different disciplines. And I think it is very important to draw lines to understand better, in the end, the dynamics between these different phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mattia Zeba, for this exploration of another very important dimension, the linguistic one, of minorities and autonomies, that again intertwines, overlaps with all the other dimensions we have touched upon. But it's now time to go back to properly religious minorities and autonomies. We'll give the floor to Professor Rossella Bottoni, who's a law and religion professor working also at the research project Atlas of Religious and Belief Minority Rights. Professor Bottoni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Technical issues.
No problem. So thank you very much. I would also like to join and extend my thanks to Professor Leone and FBK for hosting this great event, and also Professor Silvio Ferrari and Dr. Valenzi for their precious help in organizing it, and all the speakers who have given so much food for thought, and of course all the participants. So the main question of my talk is which forms of autonomy were in the past and are today recognized to religious minorities. That's going to be the bulk of my presentation. And in the conclusion, I'm also going to raise 3 more questions. Do these forms address religious minorities' needs and really promote their rights? From the religious minorities' point of view, are there forms of autonomy that are more important than others? And finally, do the differences existing among religious minorities reflect on their desired type of autonomy? And let me anticipate the answer to this latter question, and the answer is yes. And these differences are not only determined by theological doctrinal tenets, but are very much influenced by history, geography, the national context, and also the geopolitical context, which also explain why I have chosen some experiences rather than others. Contemporary forms include the European space, understood as the geographical space of the member states of the Council of Europe, and I'm also going to make some short references to the Mediterranean southern shore. And talking about the past, my obvious choice is the Ottoman Empire, not last because this year some people celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Lausanne. Some people, because of course some minorities do not celebrate it at all. This is a very important treaty, which marks a watershed not only in the regional history, but also in the legal treatment of minorities. We all know that recently Turkey asked to be officially referred to with its official name, Turkey, which is definitely going to have also an impact on religious minorities. When the first constitution was debated, there was a huge discussion on which name to adopt, Turk or Turkieli, because Turk is the ethnic Turk speaking Turkish of Muslim religion, Sunni branch, and devout to religious tenets, but not too much fundamentalist. Turkieli, where everybody else, not only religious minorities, but also Kurds, for example. So starting from the Ottoman Empire, we all know that this was characterized by a very special legal institution, the millet. In the Ottoman Empire, like in Europe at the time, members of religious minorities did not have the same rights as members of the majority religion, but as collective entities, they enjoyed great spheres of autonomy. They could regulate according to their own religious laws a great number of areas, family law, personal status, succession law, administration of justice, education. So the system has passed to history under the name of millet, which is the Turkish form of milla, which means things that today can mean very different things, religion, nation, or religious community, but these three meanings were basically synonyms at the time. And some of you may think, well, but basically that's what we also had in Europe, because after all, also Jews, for example, had separate Jewish courts, schools, and so on. But there is an important difference because the heads of the millet, the patriarch or the rabbi, was elected or appointed by the community, and this election or appointment had to be confirmed by the Ottoman emperor or government, which makes the heads, which made the heads of the millet sorts of public officials. This is a very important difference between Ottoman religious minorities and European minorities. Originally, there was just the Rum Milleti, which everybody knows as Greek Orthodox, but this name is very important because, as you know, the Byzantine Empire considered itself as the second Rome. So that was the Roman millet. Then the Armenian Gregorians, which are not Orthodox, do not make the mistake I made once, because they do not recognize the Chalcedonian canon, so they obtained a separate millet. Then it was the turn of the Jewish millet. And in the 19th century, we witness an explosion of a proliferation of the millet system for internal and external reasons. Because different identities were being developed within a millet, so they wanted to be separate. And then there was also the intervention of France, Russia, UK, United States, who wanted to promote the autonomy of specific groups in order to have a reason to intervene in the Ottoman internal affairs. So in the 1820s, we have the constitution of one Catholic millet, composed both of Latin and Eastern Rites communities, but that was not enough because just 20 years after, we have a separate Latin Rite Catholic millet and a Melkite millet. 10 years after, it was the turn of the Protestant, and this is especially interesting because this was the result of the great missionary effort of missionaries from the UK and the US. And Protestants, where do they come from? They basically were converts from the Armenian Gregorian millet and the Armenian Catholic millet. And incidentally, the fact that the Treaty of Lausanne did not recognize the rights of the Armenian nation is also the reason why the United States have never ratified that treaty. Then we have the constitution of the Bulgarian Catholic community, Bulgarian Orthodox Christian. What does this proliferation of millet tell us? Well, first of all, this raised the issue of the autonomy of minorities within the minority, which is also a result, as I said, of two different influences. From the inside, there is the development of different forms of identity, not only along religious lines, but also along language, ethnic lines. And then when we talk about autonomy, and these examples are very telling in my opinion, we don't have to think only about autonomy from the state, but as I said, also autonomy from the ecclesiastical authority. Now, as I mentioned, the development of the autonomies of religious minorities was also the result of increasing pressures by the great powers, which wanted to pursue a very specific autonomy, the creation of national states. As you can imagine, the Ottoman Empire was not very happy about these developments, and the usual argument was Muslims oppress non-Muslims, so non-Muslims need to have their own national states. So what was the answer, the solution found by the Ottoman governments in order to avoid the dissolution, the territorial disintegration of the empire? Emancipation. They started the process to recognize equality to everybody, regardless of religion. This process was based on a very important pillar, which was the dissolution of the millet system. Because if we talk about equality before the law, in the Ottoman reformers' minds, we have to talk about the replacement of the various religious laws with one uniform, let's say, secular law. And the reactions to this process are very telling of the different reactions of the communities. The strongest, and I would say the only strong reaction recorded is the one by Greek Orthodox. As a sign of protest, as many as two patriarchs resigned, and there was a church strike. All Orthodox churches in the empire were closed for 3 months. Can you imagine? I can't really imagine the closure for 3 months. So the Ottoman government then decided to give up. The Armenian Gregorians did not protest. They were generally very happy about these developments because they had a different idea of autonomy. They were already pursuing the idea of autonomy as a separate national state. Now, the passage from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey is characterized by a dramatic change. In the Ottoman Empire, religious minorities were like states within the state, so a huge autonomy. And in the Republic of Turkey, their autonomy is virtually zero because Turkey is the only member state of the Council of Europe where religious denominations, including religious minorities, have no form of legal personality. And without a legal personality, you can't exercise a number of rights connected to the contemporary idea of autonomy. The Treaty of Lausanne has two interesting provisions. Article 32. The Turkish government undertakes to take as regards non-Muslim minorities, insofar as concerns their family or personal status, measures permitting the settlement of these questions in accordance with the customs of these minorities. What does it mean? This is the liquidation of the millet system, with the exception of the competence to regulate family law and personal status issues according to religious law. This was in 1923. This lasted 3 years because in 1926, Turkey adopted the Swiss Civil Code. And here again, it's very interesting to see the different reactions by religious minorities, because the Jews and the Armenian Gregorians did not protest. At least we have no records of any opposition, and they even renounced this competence before the entry into force of the Civil Code. Once again, who protested? The Greek Orthodox. And this protest was also supported by Greece, which applied to the League of Nations. But the League of Nations said that the abolishment of these competencies and the adoption of a uniform law applying to everybody, regardless of religion, was consistent with the contemporary standards of human rights protection. What is not consistent? The deprivation of any form of autonomy, and I will explain this better, and sadly we all know about that, the limitation or suppression of the rights not only of religious but also ethnic and linguistic minorities in Turkey. Turkey regrettably ranks first by number of violations of the European Convention of Human Rights. Between 1959 to 2022, the European Court of Human Rights have found at least a violation of the Convention in 3,458 judgments. That's a lot. Treaty of Lausanne, there was another interesting provision, Article 45. The rights conferred by the provisions of this section on non-Muslim minorities of Turkey will be similarly conferred by Greece on the Muslim minority in our territory. And in the Greek region of Western Thrace, a minority rights system still exists. But many countries in the Near East have inherited the Ottoman system of the millet, Lebanon, Israel. We can still find some traces in the Constitution of Cyprus. But this is not the preferred solution in countries of the Western legal tradition. Of course, in Europe, and the European Court of Human Rights has reiterated this concept in countless judgments. In Europe, difference is regarded as an element to protect, because there is no democracy without pluralism. But religious minorities, as Professor Silvio Ferrari wrote in one of his studies, religious minorities pose more challenges than ethnic, linguistic, and cultural minorities, because they raise the issue of the recognition of heteronymous legal rules, that is, rules whose origin is attributed to an external authority. It can be God or Dharma, an authority regarded as superior to human beings, an authority which challenges states' monopoly of law. In the European system of human rights protection, the right to organizational and doctrinal autonomy of religious denominations, thus including religious minorities. What does this notion include? What is the understanding of autonomy in the European Court of Human Rights case law? This notion does not include the right to apply one's own religious law in specific fields of law, typically family law, and to have the related controversies judged by one's own courts. When I say it does not include, I don't say that this is prohibited. This is possible. I just say that there is no obligation on contracting parties to guarantee this specific form of autonomy. Which forms of autonomy are compulsory, are binding? The recognition of the right to designate religious leaders, the right to obtain a legal personality, and as I said, Turkey here commits one of the most blatant violations of contemporary standards. It includes the right to own property. It includes the ministerial exception, which is the right for a religious or belief organization to hire personnel sharing the same view as the organization and to dismiss personnel when this conformity ceases to exist. Now, coming to my conclusions and introducing the final three questions, do these forms of autonomy address religious minorities' needs? Do they really promote their rights? Well, it depends, of course. Many people campaign for religion-based personal law systems. Others are very much threatened. But this may not be the best solution for some minorities for two reasons mainly. This can be a good form to promote autonomy if it is the religious autonomy to make its own law. But in many countries, let me go a bit further. India, for example, these laws were adopted by the British colonizers, so they were laws imposed from the state. So, which kind of form of autonomy can we have here? And quoting very briefly some results from the Reminem and Mirvediadi projects to which FBK and those our colleague Dr. Fabretti have participated. These projects show that religious minorities, as I said, may not choose this as their most desired solution. Marriage, for example. Non-recognized religious minorities in Lebanon or Egypt do not vouch for the religion-based personal law system. They would simply have the possibility to celebrate religious marriages according to their own religious rules and to have these marriages recognized by the state, as it happens with the Catholic Church in Italy, basically. Or religious minorities in Algeria would simply like to have a form of marriage which is not so much influenced by Islamic norms. Some opportunities offered in packages do not suit all religious minorities. For example, the Intesa system in Italy, the system of bilateral agreements, is characterized by photocopy agreement. The same package of rights is basically offered to all religious minorities. The state has signed bilateral agreements with two Buddhist organizations. They have the right to celebrate marriage according to their own rules. But what are the Buddhist rules? I mean, is this very important for the Buddhists? Or all the legal regulations on minister of worship, which is a very specific category created having the Catholic or the Christian clergy in mind. And this category is very hardly applicable to other religious leaders. Also, some basic rights are denied to less socially accepted religious minorities. The best example I can give you is the decades-long refusal by Austrian authorities to recognize a legal personality to Jehovah's Witnesses, inter alia, because they refused to perform military service, to participate in election, they refuse blood transfusions. And here again, we can see the strong dynamics which I highlighted for Turkey, but in other countries it can be the same. The dynamic between the need for specific forms of autonomy and the prevailing notion of a national identity. And finally, from the religious minorities' point of view, are there forms of autonomy that are more important than others? Yes, as I already gave you some examples from the Ottoman Empire and the contemporary experiences. And as I said, the differences existing among religious minorities reflect on their desired type of autonomy. So I didn't mean to offer full answers to this question. I just open to offer some food for thought for the subsequent discussion. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks to Professor Bottoni for this very, very rich, very dense, and very informative a presentation. And we now give the floor for the final talk to Professor Roberto Toniati, who is Professor of Comparative Law, an expert on legal pluralism and law of European integration. Professor Toniati, the floor is yours.
Very sincere thanks for the invitation to this meeting, which has been so far very rich since the very first words by Professor Leone and Professor Ferrari. I have to say that the topic of the autonomy of religious minorities is raises a great interest on my side because of my previous research experience related to each one of the main terms of reference of the sentiment, that is, autonomy on the one hand and minorities on the other, and therefore my interest grows even more when the two terms are the object of contextual analysis. I shall also say that it is difficult to decline an invitation coming from Professor Ferrari. So when he says, you're cordially invited, it means that you cannot say no. So here I am, because of his scientific authority and nothing else. At the end, let me just say a very personal note, being in this room in particular. I had been for 5 years director of a research project within this establishment, which at that time was called Istituto Trentino di Cultura. And for those who are not familiar with the history of the foundation, Bruno Kessler, that gentleman over there is Bruno Kessler, the founder of the Istituto Trentino di Cultura at that time, but also the University of Trento. So he's really very, very popular, still very popular, at least in the academic community. So, some preliminary remarks, and thank you very much for letting me express these feelings. Now, I haven't had any paper in advance, so I can hardly present some conclusions. So I'll make some observations in general, which I had prepared, but I'll make reference also to some parts of individual talks which have been given so far. But first of all, I would like to stress the fact that the notion of minority is very, very relative, because the concept of minority is related to a variety of social phenomena, each one of them more or less relevant. For instance, billionaires are a minority, just as vegetarians or left-handed individuals. Here you are, so you're part of a minority. But not all of them are relevant for the law. I mean, do you claim any special protection as a left-handed academic? Why not? Well, I gave an idea. Because it is very relative, and of course, recognition and the rest depends on a number of variables. So we should distinguish, and you understand why I'm spending some time on this, distinguish between existential social minorities, like left-handed individuals, and legally relevant minorities. Furthermore, a minority may be legally relevant either because it is the object of repressive policies expressed by criminal legislation or discriminatory legislation in the south of the United States, in South Africa, and of course in Germany and in Italy before the war, or because it is not only recognized but also protected by the law. So a legally relevant minority is a notion within the notion of minority. Hence, we may draw a distinction between the legally relevant minorities, between A, existential free minorities. They are not positively recognized by the law, and yet they are free to exist and to develop within a private sphere. Now, if you're familiar with the territory, this is the case of the Basque country in France. I'm impressed by the developments over the years of the, let's say, awareness of Basque identity in France. Of course, there's no legal recognition, and yet even the elements of architecture are more and more Basque. And as I was going quite a bit to the Spanish Basque country, and I used the airport of Bordeaux. So I crossed the border many times, and I could, over the years, I could see the difference. So existential free minorities, B, recognized and protected minorities, and I refer to those minorities that are recipient of special legislation. For instance, they are authorized to have their own schools, their own media. And the third group that I would like to mention is supported and promoted minorities, which have their own schools and media that receive public funds. So in this sense, I mean promoted and supported. So minorities are a plural phenomenon, both socially as well as legally. This remark connects the phenomenon itself, on the one hand, to a perspective of equal protection of the law and non-discrimination. Of course, I put this on the ground of reasonable non-discrimination or reasonable discrimination. On the other side, to the need of identification of the most appropriate legal regulation. We see that we have a range of attitudes by the state that goes from indifference to legal recognition to protection and promotion. But the most appropriate legal regulation varies again according to the very nature of the constitutional system concerned. You cannot expect Spain and Indonesia to have the same pattern of regulation. And also to the claims and the requirements of the minorities themselves. In particular, we shouldn't forget that there is a category which is not so frequent any longer, but certainly it was, that was the case, I would say, until there was a sort of, let's say, minority pride, where it is one hand of one sort of another. But in the past, many people try to hide their being members of a minority. Certainly here in Trentino, we have two small German-speaking groups that are called Moke and Zimbrich, if you like. And I'm talking of, in the first case, I'm talking of less than 3,000 people. And in the second case, I'm talking of about 600 people. For a long time, they tried to hide their identity. They were not interested in showing off that they were part of this minority. But now, of course, it is very different. So I say all this because a lawyer cannot help being analytical. And when you analyze this universe of minorities, you understand that there is a lot to explore and regulate and systematize. But even in Europe, we have quite a number of problems. Now, let me quote, for instance, I say this because not in your oral presentation, but in a written presentation of yours, which I read, you mentioned affirmative action in support of minorities. Now, even in Europe, not to speak of the United States now, affirmative action is part of history. But even in Europe, affirmative action is not a metabolized notion. to the extent, for instance, that in the important protocol number 12 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is very important because it expands the protection of the principle of equality beyond the rights mentioned in the treaty, so that protection from discrimination becomes general. Only in the preamble it is mentioned that, and I quote, affirmative action as an exception to the general rule. No, sorry. Oh, that's my own comment. Let me go to the text which I have. Okay, I don't find the text. I apologize. Anyway, only in the preamble it says that the principle of non-discrimination does not prevent the states to introduce special measures in order to rebalance previous disadvantages that some categories have been suffering from. So there's no provision of that, only reference in the preamble. So even affirmative action is not so widely accepted in a European legal system. And affirmative action is still seen as an exception to the general rule. And this is still one of the main question marks which is typical of the protection of minorities. Are we introducing exceptions to the rule, to the general rule, or is the general rule for minorities physiological and structural, so it is not a deviation from what it should be? And this is very important because this may affect the impact on the perception of privileges, which is sometimes suffered from members of the majority. So all this is because I think that the focus of this research ought to be on reasonable and equitable differentiation of the regime of autonomy to be attributed to the minorities present on the territory. So I take for granted that there is differentiation, but differentiation must be reasonable and equitable. So that the target should be a definition or a construction of a minority's own autonomy in conformity with the plurality of constitutional contexts. And I say this because, as I say, even in Europe we would have difficulty, and even more when we compare Europe with the United States, and even more if we go to different continents, in particular Asia. There is one issue, for instance, which concerns the pattern of territorial settlements of the minorities, which has been mentioned already by a number of speakers. It will be difficult to find, certainly we have an example in the Basque country, but even from the political point of view, the Basque language is spoken in Navarra and in the País Vasco. And also, for instance, when it comes to Catalonia, somebody has mentioned how you mentioned Valencia, and I was there. I was in Barcelona when the independent community of Valencia has inaugurated its own Academy of Language, and in Barcelona people were laughing because it's the same language. And this I remember I was once in Croatia right after the war in Osijek, where, by the way, I was introduced as an Italian professor, but Democrat, or democratic, which I found very strange. That was Croatia, of course. But I remember that I was interviewed by a local newspaper, was asked to give my opinion on the fact that the Serbs had the condition to go back to Osijek, which is in Croatia. And that was simultaneous translation at the meetings of the town government. Now, how can you do simultaneous translation of the same language? So I said this because the context is really very important. I started a research coming from to the issue of territorial settlement of the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao in the Philippines, because that is a case of territorial distinction of a religious minority. I spent 2 weeks there, but I'm afraid that the issue was of interest to nobody, and it was very difficult to have sources of law. And then the emergency came, and apparently everything has finished. And my interest was in comparing it with the legal regulation in Aceh, which is the tip of in Indonesia, where the population is allowed to use Sharia in the most extreme, or if you like, fundamentalist form, even enforcing a criminal law of Sharia. And that is, again, a case of, but otherwise, I don't really have many. And then, of course, we are all familiar with the partition between India and Pakistan. It was at least officially grounded on religious reasons. And then, of course, there is always a problem when it comes to territorial settlement. If the minority happens to be the majority in a given territory, there will be a problem of protection of local minorities, so that the issue will still be there. Now, and then again, how do you deal with indigenous people? In the culture of indigenous people, it is unthinkable of separating religion from the sense of nature, from social ties and understandings and whatever. So it will be quite difficult. And then I'm very fascinated by the issue of religion and culture. We heard so much about it. But then I really think that we need a definition of culture. One suggestion in this field, which of course has no general application, one suggestion will be to take into consideration Article 17 on the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which establishes this sort of parallelism, and I quote, between churches and religious associations or communities and philosophical and non-confessional organizations on the one hand. So the European Commission has ties and consultations with, of course, separate, with the religious world and philosophical world. Of course, this is not a definition of culture, but I think that for the purposes of reasoning on religious minorities, this reference to the treaty might be interesting. So this needs, I would say, to be made clear when you approach a topic so challenging such as this. Again, we still have to pay for the lack of a definition of minority. It has been mentioned already. And this is not only an academic or scientific worry, it is a consequence of the fact that the definition of minority does raise political consequences. So the definition of minority has a political significance. Now, just think, for instance, in Italy, it has been recalled that the Constitution mentions linguistic minorities in Article 6. And this is quite important because we had, I'm talking of the Constituent Assembly that worked between 46 and 48, and some issues were not still settled, in particular on the oriental border At that time, for instance, the town of Trieste was a free territory of Trieste, and Yugoslavia was claiming sovereignty over the whole territory, and the whole issue was settled only in 1954. So it was important to say linguistic minorities, not national minorities, because then the Slovenians, but also the German-speaking in South Tyrol will say, well, nationally we are Austrians, or nationally we are either Slovenia or Croatian or Yugoslavia. Then in 1999, there was eventually an enactment of ordinary legislation for the protection of linguistic minorities. But then, as you mentioned, the adjective historical linguistic minority was added to make sure the Roma and Sinti were not included in the framework of protection. So you understand why I say political. And again, in Spain, also, let me say that the new word has been inaugurated in Article 2. It says, can I quote in Spanish?
Yeah.
La Constitución reconoce y garantiza el derecho a la autonomía de las nacionalidades y regiones. Como, that is, I say that if we give autonomy to Catalonia, we don't give it to the Catalans. So we keep distinction, the protection of minorities and the pattern of organization of the state. Nacionalidades. This is a word which is which is in the Spanish Constitution is synonymous of minority, and this could continue. So let me change focus now and raise a question that I'm really interested in, if you think it is interesting to have your opinion, because I have never read something on it. Now, Article 9 and Article 10, respectively, of the European Convention and the Charter of the European Union on fundamental rights, frame freedom of religion in a very strange context, I think. Article 9 has headed freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And Article 10 of the Charter, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Now, I wonder, what is the ground for not having one provision on freedom of religion per se, and putting together thought, conscience, and religion? I can understand conscience and religion, but thought should be on the rational, intellectual ground. And what is even more interesting is that the text of the provision only deals with religion. Article 9, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Okay. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Same words you have in Article 10 of the Charter. So you have the content of the provision, which I say it very, very rough way. 90% on religion and nothing on thought. Is there anything to regulate about freedom of thought? And what is even more interesting, and mind you, I talk from a secular perspective, so from my own point of view, this could be right, because in my understanding, it downgrades religion. And what is even more interesting is that the Spanish Constitution does the same. Freedom of ideology, religion, and worship. Now, in my own understanding, religion is something more than ideology. It's something more than, or if it is not more, it is different from thought or ideology. But it is interesting that I think the European pattern has already influenced the constitution of a country. Do I still have 5 minutes?
Yes, absolutely.
I have now a few remarks on the idea of autonomy of religion. Certainly, this concerns the content, what you believe in, your sources, main figures. And of course, the only limit here is ordre public. There is, and it has been mentioned already by some of you, the organizational autonomy. That is, of course, basic. In Article 8 of the Italian Constitution, it is expressly mentioned that in Article 7, the Catholic Church enjoys institutional autonomy, and other religious denominations have, I quote, the right to self-organization according to their own statutes, provided these do not conflict with Italian law. So this, and you have this in many other constitutions. So autonomy as to content, autonomy as to organization. And then we have a third, I would say, key and crucial areas, which is connected to legal pluralism. That is the being enabled to enforce not only your religious rules, but your own legal system. Some religions have a legal system of their own. So it is not only a matter of belief and organization. And this, of course, may be divided into other subcategories. For instance, the relationship between state law and religious organizations, not necessarily a religious legal system. And here I would like to recall the use of religious exemptions, which is a very frequent claim. A religious exemption as a legal privilege that exempts a member of a certain religion from a law, regulation, or requirement. Think of all the litigation that the mandatory vaccination against COVID has raised in all countries. Then again, another issue is the ministerial exception, which is meant to shield churches from improper government influence. But this, again, in many cases, becomes a religious exemption. For instance, there's much litigation in the United States, to some extent also in Italy, on the discretion that a religious organization has in hiring and even more in firing their staff. For instance, a teacher in a public school, there are many cases, the one here, also here in Trento, a lady teacher in a Catholic school that did not marry but had a permanent relationship with another lady. She was not fired, but her contract was not renewed, and the ground was exactly her homosexuality. So this lady went to court. The court accepted that the school should pay damages to the lady, but as far as I know, this private school continues to receive public funds from the local government. So, but then the issue is when a religion is also a legal system. And this is certainly true for the Catholic Church, it's true for Judaism, it's true for Islam. Now, this, of course, I want to be very short on this and deal with the problem of the acceptance of religious rules with the conventional method through which such rules may find application, and Rossella has already mentioned it. Now, let me quote the provision of the agreement between the Italian state and the Union of Jewish Communities. I think it is interesting to give evidence to this provision, and I quote, "The right to celebrate and you said this, what is the meaning? Well, the right to celebrate and dissolve religious marriages according to the law and the Jewish tradition remains unaffected without any civil effect or relevance. Well, if you are a believer, perhaps you don't give that much importance to civil effect or relevance, as long as your life horizon is within the religious community. So here, it's the law and the Jewish tradition. And I checked the text of the agreement between the Spanish states and the Jewish community there, but also between the Spanish state and the Islamic community, which do not have in Italy, the agreement says exactly the same thing. So marriage is, the religious marriage is unaffected by the agreement and by the enforcement of Italian law. So I really think that the issues related to legal pluralism are very important when we try to reason in terms of religious minorities. Of course, I repeat, this does not affect all religious minorities, but also only those having their own legal system, but they are both quantitatively and qualitatively quite important. Now, the Western legal tradition still has difficulties in dealing with the two different approaches, individual approach or communitarian approach. We are normally framed as a legal civilization based on individual rights. And already in Europe, but not elsewhere, we have already done a lot in order to recognize, if not collective rights as such, rights of communities, and then there is this intermediate form, a collective right with individual exercise, like the linguistic rights very often are framed. Let me give you an example, two examples. First, the millet system. The millet system in the Ottoman Empire protected the peoples of the book, Christians and Jews. But what about the rest? They did not have they did not have the right to use their own religious rules. And just perhaps a month ago, we had an important decision by the European Court of Human Rights related to Bosnia-Herzegovina and the electoral rights there. You know that even the preamble of the Constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina speaks of the constituent peoples and the others. Now, all the public institutions are reserved to members of the constituent peoples. And the European Court of Human Rights said that this is against the convention because all citizens should have an equal right to access the highest institutions of the state. So you understand why at the very beginning I spoke of a reasonable and equitable regulation of the rights of minorities. Because the number of minorities is, I would say, is endless. And it is important to govern this the phenomenon. And inevitably there will be litigation, there will be case law. Therefore, as much as political system may try to be careful, there may be some answers back. So, of course, we have to take into consideration the fact, and I stop here, that pluralism and on the one hand, and the importance of identity on the other hand, is becoming more and more important. So we ought to be very careful in trying to frame the rights of autonomy of religious minorities, which is very important, but also very, very challenging. Thank you.